Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Johannes Hoech, who runs the firm Promonio. And I got interested to talk to Johannes because he wrote this blog post on a $5,000 marketing technology stack that I thought was a really well done post. Johannes is a member of the Unbreaked community, and I'm delighted to have him on the show. Johannes, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we start going through this post, and you've done a really cool job of laying out a whole suite of technology tools, low-cost tools and some of them free that people can use, just give us a little bit of orientation on your practice, who you serve, the type of clients you serve, the type of work you do.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, we're actually a little software startup. This is something that I've gotten going post-retirement, and we're doing a structured revenue growth planning process and tool. And as part of that, a lot of times our customers, after they're done using the tool to put together their growth plan, they also then want help developing pipeline. And to serve that need is why we wrote the blog, so that they have kind of a how-to manual that works for a lot of the smaller B2B and professional services startups.
So what would be a few examples of a typical client of yours?
I work a lot with greenfield startups, companies that are going into new categories. Like right now, for example, one of our bigger customers is a crypto company. They're going into they have a custody solution in the crypto space, and there's no prior data. And so revenue analytics or marketing analytics doesn't really help you. You need to have a forward-looking approach, which is what we have to put together your revenue plan. So that's one category. I do a fair amount of turnaround work, companies who either are shrinking or not growing, or they're below what the investors' expectations are, and they need to put together a plan for how to get out of the pickle. And then thirdly, I work a fair amount with professional services firms that, like I have a couple of customers that are large sales consulting firms. I have a couple of engineering firms, a law office. And again, all of those are basically aiming at a B2B target population. And they either want to figure out how to go into a new space or they're in a turnaround phase. And so that's who we typically work for. Most of the personas I sell to are either the CEO or the CRO, the head of sales. Occasionally I work with CMOs, and occasionally I work with revenue operations, but it's always at the C level.
All right, great. So I'll give listeners just a quick kind of table of contents here of this blog post. So it's organized into tools that are relevant for the following kind of questions. Number one, who to target. Number two, how to target. Number three, how to implement your low-cost marketing technology stack. So let's go through each one of those sections. So let's start with section one, who to target. So Johannes, tell me a little bit about that question and some of the tools that people can use to figure out what companies to target.
The reason we start there is a lot of companies basically have different sales models, and they're by and large driven either by what they sell. For example, a professional services firm would be very different from a software firm. But secondly, more importantly, what is the size of the price point? If you sell $500,000 software, it's fundamentally a very different sales proposition and a different target demographic you need to reach than, say, if you sell a $5,000 or $500 services offering, fractional this or that. And what a lot of companies are struggling with is sort of how do you align your target personas, your go-to-market approach, and then subsequently your tech stack with who exactly you're targeting. And so we tend to go through an initial process called precision segmentation, where we really home in on, who's buying from you, and then secondly, go into the value propositioning and why. And then that typically drives the go-to-market architecture. Do you use LinkedIn on one end? Do you use direct enterprise outbound selling on the other end? There's a variety of approaches you could use. And having the initial questions nailed down who's your target demographic and why are they buying from you, then subsequently drives the go-to-market model, and with that drives the tech stack. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to get straight in that first part of the blog to make sure that people are sort of dialed in to what their strategic reality is. With that said, a lot of services firms and a lot of small B2B startups, by and large, have very similar go-to-market approaches, and quite often using LinkedIn as one of the arrows in their go-to-market quiver is a common choice, partly because it allows you to do very precise targeting. And so we then build a tech stack around that kind of technological base, because that's a pretty common request for a variety of these scenarios.
Now, you recommend a tool called Pattern.ai.co. Tell us about that tool.
A fair amount of understanding of who your ideal customer is, what's your ICP, or what we call the precision segmentation, is if you think of it from a sort of McKinsey point of view, what are the raw data sources that I can pull together that give me a sense of who I'm selling to? Some of it, of course, is expert stakeholder interviews, like the founder, the CTO, or whoever. A lot of it is also customer interviews or prospect interviews to see who resonates. But a third piece is digging into whatever CRM data they might have available. And quite often, once you've done an initial data cleanup and really make sure that the data they have in their CRM tool has been fully instrumented, so you can track it by vertical, by company size, by title, whatever attribute you want to start regressing against. A tool like Pattern AI is sort of a machine learning based regression tool that allows you to pick up those patterns. And they specialize in reading patterns and reading regression results in CRM data. That's one of their concrete offerings. So
what would you do with a tool like Pattern.ai.co? You take you would have to have existing sales data, so past history, and you would feed into it the LinkedIn profiles or something of all the clients you've served in the past, and then it would identify some patterns among your past clients that help you identify future clients. Is it something like that?
Yeah, that's close. There's basically two use cases. Imagine you launch a completely new company like this crypto outfit. There's a collective 3 months of data. There is no prior data. So there you have to use a fundamentally different approach, and something like Pattern AI wouldn't help you. However, if you are in a company, let's say a turnaround, where you're not hitting the numbers that you want to hit, but you have a fair amount of data, and this is a big and, the data has been upgraded to a good quality standard. Most CRM tools, the data that's in there is junk, so it's really not usable for analysis. But let's assume that the data has been upgraded. Then you can start running regressions where you can see, and you regress against either size of deal or conversion rates or closure rates, depends what your outcome metric is. But you can now regress against sales rep names, territories, products, verticals, company sizes, titles, I'm making this up, but undertakers in northern Michigan might be a resonant vertical because, they have high conversion rates, they have high sales velocity, and they have high average sales prices, whereas dive instructors in southern Florida don't. And unless you do that kind of an analysis, you won't see those kinds of patterns.
All right. So then the next section is how to target. And you talk about a tool called Goldcast.io. Tell us about that tool.
Yeah. That gets, let's say we figured out who our target demographic is and what their value prop is. Now I know, okay, I want to sell to undertakers in northern Michigan and dive instructors in southern Florida. How do I reach these folks? And one of the significant post-COVID changes that's been happening is really traditional enterprise sales methods are dying on the vine. You can't travel there anymore. Events are, canceled, or now maybe this year, it depends on Omicron, they might start up again, or this coming year, that is. So you really have to figure out how to squeeze as much out of the online and virtual selling lemon as you can. And Goldcast has a really cool product. I like it a lot. There are actually a couple of Harvard MBAs that dropped out to start this company. It's an interesting story. And they realized that if you basically feed LinkedIn data and some other demographic data into a conference call tool, a virtual, like let's say your Zoom, but as you're in your Zoom call, you also have all the LinkedIn data that you need and all the other demographic data that you need present. So let's say you have 20 or 30 individuals on a call and you're trying to find out who is relevant. They will give you a quick read on who's on the call and whether or not they're matched to your criteria based on their LinkedIn profile. And then they also allow you to break away and enter a little chat room with them and have a separate conversation. And so let's say you and I are on a call together and you're one of 29 and I want to actually reach you. This tool will tell me that out of the 30 people on the call, you're the guy that's relevant. And then it also gives me the capability to privately communicate with you and address you. And that's really a really interesting idea, because that is something that you couldn't do in a live sales call. Yet in a virtual environment where you have that technology ready to go, you really have a capability that you otherwise wouldn't have. And so I feel this is a very good example for the kind of innovation that has been happening in the marketplace since COVID, where people are reinventing the old ways of doing it, and the resulting outcome is actually better than what you had before.
Yeah. Now, let me see if I understand this Goldcast.io tool. This is something that would be a plugin that I could use if I'm on a Zoom or a Teams call, or would this be something where everybody would actually have to be on the video conference through the Goldcast app?
Yeah, it's their own platform. So it's like GoToMeeting or Zoom. So you would basically conduct the call on their platform.
Oh, I gotcha.
And then by using their platform, you do have access to all this other data.
Okay, cool. Let's go on to some of the other ones that you mentioned. So in terms of connecting with people, you talked about a tool called dux-soup. That's DUX-soup. What's that?
Yeah, dux-soup. There's a few more competitors coming out now. I think one is called Alfred. dux-soup is probably the veteran in the space. As we said earlier, increasingly B2B selling is at least in part relying on using LinkedIn as a tool. And LinkedIn has several capabilities. Obviously, it's a big advertising platform, but that's not what I'm talking about here. It's really the ability to target and identify people, because you can do very precise filtering. I can pick titles, I have Boolean searches I can do, and so forth. And then I reach out to them. But rather than reaching out to people one by one, it'd be interesting to do it in bulk, so that you can say, okay, give me every VP of sales in a company with 20 to 100 employees in such and such a vertical and such geography. It'll come up with the 98 names in that particular segment search, and then you can use dux-soup to reach out to them in bulk. And technically what dux-soup is it's a Chrome extension, so it sits on top of your browser. And it's essentially a robot that pretends to be you. And so LinkedIn, as far as LinkedIn is concerned, you're logged into your profile. You're reaching out to these people, but really under the hood, dux-soup does it for you automatically. It's kind of a robot. And they have some randomization features. So they, for example, don't just send out a call every 22 seconds. They randomize the contact schedule, and they mimic basically human behavior. But at the end of the day, instead of you having to sit here and spend 2 or 3 hours inviting people one by one, you turn it on in the morning and you let it run in the background, and 3 hours later, you have 100 more invitations that went out.
That's interesting. So I imagine that there's a bit of an arms race between LinkedIn and tools like this, because I think LinkedIn doesn't really appreciate having those automated bot things spamming people. So what's the risk that your account gets punished by LinkedIn if you use a tool like that?
Well, actually, a good way to not get punished is to use a tool like that, and it's a little bit like some other, technologies that we have available in our lives. It's not necessarily the technology per se is bad; it's more how you use it. And this is where we work a fair amount with our customers to make sure that, first of all, don't send out a spamming message. Hi, Will, I'm a great consultant, and I want to talk to you. That would not be the way to get a hold of you. However, if you put out a content campaign where you might say, I have an interesting blog. Let's say in my case, I have this blog on this low cost tech stack, and gee, you're, trying to build a consultancy. Wouldn't you be interested? And people are open to receiving that kind of a message. People are not necessarily open to obviously being sold to. So I think it's less around the tool, it's more how you do it. Secondly, LinkedIn has imposed some maximum limits, so you can really only invite 100 people per week. So this is not necessarily a tool that sort of gets you in front of thousands of people. But what we typically use it for is we use it to build out our First Connect network. And then once you have connected with people on a first connection basis, you can nurture them with kind of a high content nurture where you send them, messages that are relevant to them. So again, it's all about how you do it. It's not what kind of tool you use that drives the effectiveness. And so I think as long as you observe those kinds of rules, you stay below the limits, you're not really spamming people, you're providing valuable content. So it's really more informational than selling. LinkedIn usually is okay with that.
Okay. And you mentioned another tool, SalesHandy. Tell us about that one.
Those are just, there's a plethora of tools out there. Since I wrote the blog, there's actually a new tool out that I prefer now. It's called Apollo, but SalesHandy is essentially kind of a higher functionality alternative to MailChimp. It's an automated email outreach. If you think about your go-to-market, typically there's really sort of 4 touch points. One is the LinkedIn outreach that we just talked about. I'm sending out invites, and then if somebody connects, I might put them on a First Connect monthly nurture with some high content material. Well, you do the same on email, except the problem now with email is it's getting less and less effective. And really there, the dictum of, don't sell to them, provide them useful content is even more pronounced than with LinkedIn. And SalesHandy allows you, and some other more sophisticated tools allows you to put together these cadences so that you don't have to send every email by hand, but you can say stage up whatever, a series of 3 or 5 emails, and it then executes it in the background and sends it to your target demographic with the relevant content.
All right, great. And then you get into the section of how to implement your low-cost MarTech stack. So, and you start with talking about a couple CRM tools, Pipedrive, which I've used for a long time and learned about from David A. Fields. And we did, by the way, an episode, if you're interested in this topic, episode I think 170 or 172 was David giving me his thoughts on how to set up Pipedrive. So you mentioned Pipedrive and you mentioned Dedupely. Talk about Dedupely.
Well, Pipedrive is sort of a low-cost alternative to Salesforce, and there's several players in that space. There's Zoho and Sugar CRM, and even HubSpot now has a low functionality CRM capability so that you have sort of a one-stop solution. And Pipedrive for smaller startups like myself is the perfect solution. It's a low-cost footprint. It has abbreviated functionality. It's really easy to use, but it has a good ecosystem of apps that it integrates with. And so it's just a great tool. And by the way, it also has its own email functionality. It's sort of a Swiss Army knife that has the basics of everything you need. And however, one issue you end up having is, let's say you're using several address database tools, Crunchbase or Apollo or LinkedIn, as we talked about earlier. And you also may have some inbound traffic on your website and people register. And the CRM system now sucks this all in. And now I suddenly have 4 instances of Will Bachman in my database, but it's really all the same person, except there's 4 records because they came in through 3 or 4 different channels. So I need to constantly clean up my database, so I only have 1 record. And so having a tool that does deduplication at scale is a key ingredient. So Dedupely is one of those.
Okay, cool. And then you talk about, you mentioned Crunchbase, and I've thought from time to time about Crunchbase. How would people use Crunchbase, and also how much does it cost? I seem to have checked it a while ago, and I remembered it was not cheap.
Crunchbase is kind of a niche database. It's mostly aimed at the startup scene. They keep track of funding events and funding data. So if you think about LinkedIn gives you a lot of the firmographic and demographic data. So I know what vertical you're in, and I know what company size and where you're located and what your title is. I don't necessarily know a lot about your company. And in particular, the financials, funding stages, investors, those kinds of things. That's something that Crunchbase tracks. But as I mentioned a couple of times now, since the writing of the blog, I've also gotten alerted to a tool called Apollo.io, I think it is. And that is essentially, think of it as MailChimp plus LinkedIn plus Crunchbase all in one. So I can basically search for target companies. I can search by vertical, by funding stage, by financing, by revenue. There's a variety of dimensions. I can search for individuals, and they have almost an identical search functionality to LinkedIn. And then I can actually, from within the app, send them emails. Email cadence is similar to what we talked about SalesHandy earlier. So the tech stack, and this is evidence of the rapid innovation that's been going on for the last 18 months since COVID, has kind of advanced a little bit since writing of the blog. But that's basically what these tools do, so that you have a full data set for your targeting. Again, we'll get back to the very beginning of our conversation, precision segmentation. I need to know who I'm going after and what's my ICP. Those are all the kinds of tools that help you collect the attributes out there so that you can put that picture together.
Tell me about LinkMatch. That's another tool that you mentioned.
Yeah, LinkMatch is basically similar to dux-soup, but except it does it one by one. LinkMatch has various integrations with various CRM tools and LinkedIn. And so let's say you're on LinkedIn, you're browsing around, you're looking for people, and you find a particular person that comes up that you find interesting. And you'd like to have them in your CRM tool. And LinkMatch, if you have it activated, it's another Chrome extension. If you have it activated, it gives you a little button that says import into Pipedrive or import into HubSpot, whatever your CRM tool is. You hit that button, it automatically brings it in. So it's just a import functionality that allows you to one by one import LinkedIn contacts into your CRM tool. Similar to what dux-soup does at scale. They do it on a one by one basis.
Now you mentioned another tool, CrystalKnows, and that's CrystalKnows. You're right, it's an AI tool that you can use to scan a person's LinkedIn profile and assess their personality type to help get suggestions on what kind of messages to send. So I'm curious to go scan my own profile right now and see what kind of personality I have.
You should. It's usually actually pretty spot on. That's what everybody does. The minute they implement this app, first thing they do is they check themselves out and they're like, huh. And then they check out 5 friends and they go, wow, this is pretty close. It's actually one of my favorite tools. I love it. If you think about this whole process that we went through, we're trying to target who do we sell to. And that's the whole Crunchbase, LinkedIn, Apollo, all the segmentation and so forth. And now I have my ICP. I know who to go after. The next story is really what do I talk to them about? And part of that is the value prop, but part of it is also having some sense of, who they are online. And a tool that's mentioned in the blog is a tool called Sharetivity, which basically gives you real-time a picture of their online presence. So what's their blogging, what's their Twitter activity, what's their Facebook, what have you. So it essentially tells you what to talk about. And then the third piece is, of course, how do you approach them? And this is where CrystalNose comes in. It gives you not only this online personality assessment, and basically what they do, they map you, the requester, and them into a disk profile, and then you kind of get a little bit of this disk wheel, and you can see where you are and where they are. But then the part that's more interesting is it actually makes recommendations on how to approach them. What are email subject lines or email topics or verbal requests, and what's the style with which to approach people. So think of it as then it's a tool that tells you how to talk to them. If somebody's introverted and shy, it's a very different approach than if somebody's type A personality, totally extroverted. And they'll give you a sense of what's the appropriate communication style. And at first I was dubious, but then, like I said, I sort of used it. I've now implemented it with several customers. Sales guys love it because it gives them a sense of how to approach people and gives them ideas for kind of sentences to start a conversation with and so forth, and it's really practical for that.
Now, this next one sounds like a super useful tool, Sharetivity. You're right. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, that's the one that I just mentioned. It kind of goes hand in hand with CrystalKnows in that Sharetivity gives you a near real-time picture of someone's online presence or online posture. So if I, let's say, bring up, and you do it from within LinkedIn, so I open up LinkedIn. Sorry, my cat is in the background here. If you open up LinkedIn and I bring up your profile, I can, and these are all, again, extensions, I can then click on Sharetivity and it will bring up everything you can find within the next 5 or 10 seconds that you might have published out on the internet. So I can very quickly see what's your public posture. So I might say, so CrystalKnows essentially tells me how to approach you, and then Sharetivity tells me an initial topic. Oh, gee, I really liked your Twitter post last Tuesday. It was great. And the guy goes, well, how do you know that? Well, really, Sharetivity told me.
So beyond just what the person's on the LinkedIn profile, you can see if they've been on a podcast or written a blog post or been quoted somewhere. That sounds powerful.
Welcome to. Well, actually, it's actually kind of funny because I did it myself, obviously, and checked myself out, and I was informed that I was in jail in Tokyo, which clearly wasn't the case. So I don't think it's 100% correct, but.
Okay, so let's see. We already talked about some of these next ones here. Let's go down to Hootsuite.
Hootsuite, yeah. So now let's say we've targeted people. We know who we're going to go after. We know what they say online. We know what their personality is. We have a sense of the value prop. We can approach them. Now I want to reach them, and I want to sort of publish myself so that I have myself a public posture. Hootsuite is essentially a social media listening and publishing tool. So if you, for example, I publish every day something. Sometimes it's my own content. Sometimes it's things that I like and I pass on. I try to pass on sort of high quality materials. And Hootsuite is basically a publishing platform where I can stage my Facebook posts, my Twitter posts, my LinkedIn posts. And I usually do it 2 weeks ahead. So I basically, every 2 weeks on a Saturday morning, I pull together my social media content, stage it up in Hootsuite, and then it blows it out every day at 8:15 a.m. And that's one thing it does. And then the second thing it does, I can actually subscribe to certain channels. So if I'm interested in a particular Twitter profile or LinkedIn feed or whatever, it pulls it together in a dashboard. And so rather than me having to chase around these various social media platforms, I can see everything in one pane of glass.
Now, you mentioned Paper.li, that you're right, it helps you curate already published content into newsletters, which you can send to your customers. Tell us about how that works.
Yeah, I have a variety of news feeds, Feedly, Paper.li. Those are, some of these came out of the old RSS feed technology, and they since then spun out independent apps. Google used to have a functionality. I forgot what it's called. Another one was called FeedBurner. There was a whole bunch of these, and it's just one that I use because back to what we said in the beginning when you had your question around, LinkedIn, what are the do's and don'ts? A key thing that we always preach around doing marketing in this or selling in this digital age, don't sell to people. Most people are allergic to that. Provide them useful content. However, that requires that you have your kind of fingers out there and you know what's being talked about and what's out there in the various venues. Medium, for example, is a good one along the same lines. And so this is just one of the news feeds for given topics. I track various topics and I have them feed me what is getting published that fits those topics.
Fantastic. So there is more listed on the blog post that Johannes put out there. Johannes, we will include a link to your blog post in the show notes for this. So listeners that want to get the more details and all the links, we'll also include the links to the apps and the tools that we mentioned on this episode. And Johannes, if people want to find out more about your practice, where would you want to point them?
Well, just to our website, www.premonio.com. Premonio is like premonition, premonio.com. And we have a fair amount of content around growth architecting, which is this structured approach to revenue growth planning. If people are interested in that, we have a lot around scientific forecasting, making sure that you hit your numbers. We have a lot about various demand generation and lead gen techniques, kind of the practical how-to, like the blog that we talked about today. And in general, just hopefully useful content that people find interesting.
Fantastic. Johannes, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was very interesting.